Hey, what's up, Superdads? So I am here today with a bit of a pet peeve and rant about something that I've noticed, a trend I've noticed recently among YouTube fitness influencers. For a long time, quite a while now, the sort of science-based claim has been tossed around all over the place by people. This is the science-based way of training. This is science-backed. This is research-backed. Blah 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 blah. And my contention has always been great. You know, science is something that you should reference if you have questions. But really, trial and error is the only way to find out what works for you as an individual. And so I notice that a lot of people fall into what I call science reliance, where they believe, you know, somebody's, not even the papers, not even the research, but somebody's interpretation of the research more than their own lying eyes and their own lived experience, to use a troublesome term. So that has been going on for a long time. But recently, I've been noticing kind of the opposite trend, a backlash against this, where people say, you know, screw this science. All you need to do is progressively overload. And they'll say this, and then they'll actually reveal that what they mean by that is all you need to do is lift heavier and heavier weights. Now, the ones who are a little bit more, in the know will then say, in the range of, whatever it is, 6 to 12 or 8 to 12, in the traditional hypertrophy ranges, because they recognize that doing heavy singles, while it can build muscle, is not optimal for building muscle, and very dangerous. So, they're at least pushing you towards a rep range that's helpful. And I've had, great results with focusing on achieving progressive overload in exactly those rep ranges. So I'm not here to tell you that focusing on progressive overload isn't a beneficial thing to do. What I am here to say is that it's not a perfect way to approach your training, and it's certainly not what many of these influencers seem to be claiming that it is. So, first, let's start with the fact that progressive overload is not limited in any way to lifting heavier and heavier weights. Obviously, there's also the option of increasing the number of repetitions that you're doing with a given weight. There's also changing the cadence, so you slow down the repetitions that you're doing. You spend more time under tension with the same number of repetitions and the same weight. There's increasing the density of your training, so you're taking fewer breaks during your training. You are packing the same amount of work into a smaller time period. That's density. There's range of motion. So if you go from doing micro reps or only lengthened partials or something like this to now doing full range of motions, you are spending more time dealing with that weight and you're logging more time near failure. Okay, and there's also form. You could improve your form as well, and that could constitute progressive overload for you. So there are all these different ways, and so to boil it down to just you need to lift heavier and heavier, it's I don't think that the people who say this actually think that that's the only thing that constitutes progressive overload, but that's the message that they're giving people, and it suggests to me that they think their audience isn't smart enough to understand that progressive overload is a more nuanced concept, or maybe they just think the simple stuff is what works, and the simple stuff is what works, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't understand that the simple stuff isn't all that simple, right? Applying it may be relatively simple, but having a deeper knowledge base, right, is also important as well if you're going to really become an expert at this thing called exercise. Okay, the next problem with the way that it's presented is, what is exercise? Okay, my definition is that exercise is any activity that provides stress sufficient to drive physiological adaptation, resulting in increased physical capacity. So if you're stressing your body so that your body adapts in a way that increases its physical capacity, that is an exercise activity that qualifies. The way that they're presenting progressive overload, though, is they're saying, well, it's lifting heavier weights. Lifting heavier weights is a demonstration of increased physical capacity. So essentially, what they're saying is something like the way to increase your physical capacity is to increase your physical capacity or to demonstrate that you've increased your physical capacity. Obviously, this is circular and kind of nonsense. Progressive overload is evidence of progress, not a driver of progress. I will repeat that because it's super important. Progressive overload is evidence of progress, not a driver of progress. Here's what they're saying. You want to build muscle and get stronger, lift heavier weights. Well, that's like saying, do you want to learn more? Get better grades. Obviously, it's nonsensical. The better grades are the consequence of you having learned more. Lifting heavier weights is a consequence of you having gotten stronger. Now, does that mean that focusing on increasing your numbers, the amount of weight that you can lift, or any sort of progressive overload metric that like the ones I outlined earlier, is a bad idea? Absolutely, it is not. But you need to understand what the purpose of progressive overload is. Progressive overload is something that we focus on in order to maintain sufficient training intensity. Because over time, if all you focus on is training intensely, is training to failure, these sorts of things, many people, it's like human nature, will have the tendency to start slacking off a little bit. It's called a slippery slope systems archetype, and you find it all over the place. And essentially, it's you do a little bit less one time, and nothing disastrous happens. There's no immediate negative feedback that dissuades you or punishes you for having slacked off a little bit. And so next time that's the standard. And so the next time when you hit that standard maybe a couple times, but you slack off a little bit more. And so the standard just gets eroded and eroded further and further. Progressive overload is something that we are concerned with because it ensures that we are pushing ourselves hard enough, that we are training intensely enough. Okay, so progressive overload facilitates intensity, not the other way around. Intensity is the goal. Training intensity is what drives the physical adaptation because it's the intensity of the training that equals stress for your body, and the stress is what, again, drives that adaptation. So just to illustrate this, let's do a thought experiment. Let's say you have one trainee who starts with a 1 pound weight, and they do 8 repetitions for their workout. And then the next time they come back, they do 1.25 pound weight, and they do 8 repetitions. And every session they come back and they increase by some marginal amount the weight of the lift that they're the weight of the weight that they're lifting, right? That is progressive overload. That qualifies as progressive overload. By any definition of the word, that qualifies. Okay, now we have another trainee who focuses on training super intensely, spending time near failure, getting proximal to failure, if not reaching failure, and just exhausting their muscles, right? And never measures the weights. Okay, they both train for, let's say, 6 months. Which of these two people is going to get better results? The answer is so obvious that it should smack you in the face. Now, is this an absurd reduction of progressive overload to say you're starting with a 1 pound weight and you're incrementally increasing it? Yes, it is, but that's why thought experiments are useful, because they allow you to dig into the core, the core tenet, the axiom at the core of an argument. And what those who just say progressive overload is what drives muscle and strength gains are saying is that it's just increasing the weight that you're lifting, whatever else they want to talk about it. It's not true. It's the intensity. Progressive overload facilitates intensity, not the other way around. Okay, there's another concept that I've heard, which is that one influencer that I am quite fond of has said lifter's amnesia. This is his phrase for it. And he claims that this is when advanced lifters, look at what they're doing now, and they tell people what they're doing now is what everyone should be doing. And they're forgetting that what they did to get to an advanced level, to build the muscle that they have now, was completely different than what they're doing now. And what they did to get there was progressively overload. Focus solely on progressive overload. Okay, and he calls this lifter's amnesia. Well, there's another way to look at that if you were to reframe it. You could look at it as veteran wisdom. Perhaps what's happening here is people who have gone through all of these different types of training, who've tried all sorts of different things and gotten to something that they find really works for them, are saying, I'm trying to help you skip all of the trial and error. And here is what I have found from decades of experience in some cases works for people who want to build muscle and strength safely. And that is super key. That's super key because a lot of us who are in this position, who've been doing this for a long time, when we look back, we're looking at this training. It's not just that this training modality didn't produce the effects I wanted. In many cases, it produced negative effects. It produced exactly the opposite of what exercise is meant to produce. And if I can remind you, that is an increase in physical capacity. If you injure yourself, you are decreasing your physical capacity. You are becoming, maybe you get stronger, so you might get more fit, but you're less healthy because you're injured, or maybe you're sick because you pushed yourself too hard or something like this. Okay, so really what I think might be happening is that those people who talk about lifters' amnesia are actually suffering from injury amnesia. There's a lot of the people who push nothing but progressive overload, what they ignore is all of those times in their pasts when they have ended up hurting themselves because they were just pursuing heavier and heavier weights all the time and not thinking about what was actually driving the progress that they were seeking. There are a lot of people out there, if you look into their content deeply, who at some point talk about all of the injuries that they had. I don't want to be trained by, and I don't want to learn how to exercise from somebody who, yes, who is strong now, who is aesthetic now, but who got there by training, by going through knee replacements and hip replacements and shoulder surgeries and herniated discs and things like that. Unless that person is saying, I did all that stuff and I injured myself in all those ways, and now I've found a way that I've stayed injury free. If they're saying you need to go through that too, the way that I got to where I am is the only way there is to get here, and that means you need to go through the same, injury minefield that I went through. I'm not interested, because there are people out there who have trained lots of people with no injuries, or who have helped heal injuries while still getting incredible results. So please be aware of that, especially for beginners. I'm not the kind of guy who's going to tell you if you want to learn how to drive, you need to drive fast and you're going to get in accidents, right? That's what it sounds like to me when people say focus on lifting heavy, and if injuries are just part of the bargain, right? You can't avoid them. That's just nonsense. It's not true. Okay. One other thing that I've heard is, well, it works for experienced lifters, but it won't work for novices, right? If it builds muscle for experienced lifters, it will build muscle for novices. Experienced lifters have a harder time building muscle, much harder, not the opposite way around. If focusing on intensity, if training infrequently builds muscle for experienced lifters, it will build muscle for novices, because the people who are experienced lifters have the curse of diminishing returns working against them. They have age working against them. They have a body that is desensitized to training working against them. Novices, almost anything will work for them. So if there's a safe, effective way to build muscle that an experienced lifter has discovered, that is what the novice should do. Now, I will, make this conditional upon, for some novice lifters, it's hard to train hard enough to get failure, to push the intensity. And so adding a few extra reps or a few extra sets can help them to develop it. But saying that someone doesn't have the skill yet to train like an experienced lifter, so they need to train like, a novice lifter, which means putting themselves through the minefield of injuries and all these other things, is complete nonsense. You just start training the novice lifter on the skills that will get them to where the experienced lifter is as quickly as possible. So start having them try to push the intensity, increase the time near failure that they're logging, do things safely, work within a challenging range of motion. These sorts of habits that will develop over time, just like any skill does, and they won't have to go through all of the injuries and all of the cul-de-sacs of progress where you run into a dead end. Okay, so rant over. Progressive overload is important. It's a very important concept. It's an important concept because it keeps us honest. It keeps us pushing ourselves. It keeps us from being lazy or complacent with our training. Oh, I went to failure. I'm fine. Right? Did you really? Did you really? Because you should be getting stronger if you're training well and you're recovering well, and that should show up, in your progressive overload in one of the metrics that I listed earlier. Maybe not every time, but most of the time you should be improving in some way. And if you're not, it's either you're not recovering well enough, you're not training hard enough, or you're not training hard enough the previous session to drive the adaptation, or you're not pushing yourself hard enough in whatever set it is that you just did that didn't improve. So an important concept, yes, but it is not as simple as you just need to lift heavier and heavier weights. All right. So if you're interested in learning more about how I approach this stuff, you can check out the programs below. There's a free one down there, 3-Minute Muscle, and one for all sorts of different populations available on Udemy. There's also the Facebook group. Go ahead and join up with us if you have any, you want to have more personal interaction off of YouTube where the lurkers be. Okay, thanks so much for your attention. Go be super.